The sun had long dipped below the Antarctic horizon, not to return for months. Here, winter is not simply a season, it is a reign of darkness and cold, so absolute that it bends the will of every living creature. On this vast, icy continent, night swallows the land for weeks on end, and the only light comes from the ghostly glow of the moon, the sharp scatter of stars, and the green and purple curtains of the aurora australis, flickering silently across the black dome of sky. The wind here has a voice. It howls and screams, carrying needles of ice that slice through the air at over 100 kilometers an hour. The temperature has plunged to minus 40 degrees Celsius, the kind of cold that does not merely bite, it consumes, creeping through feathers and flesh, seeking the warmth of blood. This is not a place where life should exist, and yet, gathered here in their thousands from a distance, the colony is a dark, pulsating mass on the white plain. They stand shoulder to shoulder, chest to back, bodies pressed so close that their individual outlines blur into one vast living wall. Each male holds an egg delicately balanced on the tops of his feet, tucked beneath a flap of warm feathered skin called a brood pouch. Inside each egg, a tiny unhatched chick is suspended between survival and death. Dependent on, among the crowd stands one young male. His feathers are sleek, their black sheen catching the faint light when the aurora swirls overhead. This is his first winter as a father, and though instinct guides his every movement, there is a subtle stiffness in his posture, a tension born of inexperience. Hours ago, he received the egg from his mate in a transfer that lasted only seconds. She had laid it after weeks of fasting, her body thin and her strength nearly spent. In that brief, critical moment, she rolled the egg toward him across the ice, and he bent low to catch it, sliding it onto his feet. If it had touched the ice, even for half a minute, the cold would have killed the developing chick. There is the young male H around the young male begins his turn at the outer edge, the wind slamming into his back. Ice crystals cling to his feathers, forming a brittle crust. Beneath his brood pouch, the egg stays pressed against the warmth of his skin, its temperature held steady at around 37 degrees Celsius. The difference between life and death for the chick is no more than a few degrees. He shifts his weight subtly from foot to foot, careful never to lift both at once. If the egg were to slip, there would be no recovery. Ovidays blur together into a cycle of stillness and subtle motion. The males do not wander. They cannot risk leaving their eggs unprotected. Every action is calculated for efficiency, every breath a measured cost in heat. Snow falls in fine, dry flakes, coating their backs until they resemble statues carved from marble and coal. The silence is broken only by the soft rustle of feathers and the low hum of their calls, each male occasionally letting out a note as if to remind the colony and himself that he is still here. Still H. Hun, he remembers the look in his mate's eyes before she left. There had been no words, of course, but there had been something else, a deep, unspoken understanding that he would hold the line until she The wind changes, carrying with it the low, distant roar of a storm building beyond the horizon. He adjusts his stance, feeling the shift ripple through the huddle. Without speaking, without even looking, the males draw closer together, their bodies compressing into an even tighter shield. The storm will come, and it will pass, and they will remain. That is the way of things here. The night will stretch on, but the young emperor will not falter. His far above, the hidden sun traces its invisible path, waiting for the moment it will rise again. When that day comes, and the ice blazes under the returning light, perhaps his mate will appear on the horizon, belly full of fish, ready to meet the life they created together. But until then, the white night belongs to the fathers, standing sentinel in the frozen heart of the world. In the frozen stillness of the Antarctic plateau, life begins with a ritual as delicate as it is perilous. For the emperor penguin, there is no warm nest, no protective burrow. Instead, the very ground beneath them is an enemy so cold it can kill in less than a minute. And yet, it is here, on the open ice, that one of nature's most fragile exchanges takes place, the handover of the egg from mother to father. The young male had been waiting for days, pacing within the bounds of the courtship area, his movements restrained by the growing urgency he felt inside. His mate was nearing the end of her long fast. Since the start of the breeding season, she had eaten nothing, surviving on the fat reserves she had built in the summer. The creation of the egg had drained her further still. Now, every step she took was slow, deliberate, her belly low to the ice, her breath visible in the frigid air. Around them, other pairs prepared for the same moment. The scene was strangely silent, broken only by the occasional trumpet-like call from a male announcing his readiness. The air was thick with tension, because every bird here knew the truth. This was the most dangerous few seconds of their breeding cycle. When the moment came, it happened almost without signal. She crouched slightly, the muscles in her body tightening. With a soft, breathy exhalation, she laid the egg, perfect oval, pale and smooth, shimmering faintly under the dim Antarctic light. It rolled gently between her feet, steam rising briefly as the last trace of her warmth escaped into the open air. Time was already running out. The male stepped forward, his body lowering, wings spread slightly for balance. He shuffled his feet with extreme care, aligning them just beneath the egg. One slip, one wrong movement, and the shell could crack or chill fatally. In this cold, an exposed egg could lose its vital warmth in less than a minute. The embryonic chick inside, succumbing before either parent could react. With practiced precision, though his inexperience made the movement slower than that of older males, he nudged the egg onto his own feet. The contact was immediate and electric. He could feel the faint weight of it, the potential life within. His brood pouch dropped over it like a curtain, trapping the heat of his body against the shell. The warmth began to seep back in, stabilizing the temperature at the precious threshold of 37 degrees Celsius. For a moment, they stood together, their bodies almost touching, heads bent low so that their beaks nearly brushed. There was no spoken vow, but the bond between them was sealed in that shared breath. She looked at him, her eyes dark and clear, holding a message that needed no translation. You must keep it safe. Then, slowly, she stepped back. The departure of the female was a scene both ordinary and heart-wrenching. She turned toward the distant, unseen ocean, her body swaying as she began the long march. The journey ahead was a gauntlet of shifting ice, hidden crevasses, and the ever-present threat of leopard seals near the water's edge. But hunger drove her forward. If she did not eat soon, her strength would fail entirely. The male watched her until her form blended into the distant shapes of other departing females. He could no longer tell which was her among the moving silhouettes, but he could still hear her voice in his mind. Emperor penguins possess a remarkable ability. Each bird's call is unique, a complex pattern of pitches and rhythms that acts like a fingerprint. When she returned weeks later, he would recognize her instantly among thousands. Now, the weight of his role settled fully upon him. The egg was his to guard, too warm, to shield from the deadly ice and the screaming wind. He would not see food or open water for over 2 months. His fat reserves, built up during the summer, would shrink day by day, his body transforming into a vessel of endurance. All around him, other males completed their own handovers, the same tense choreography playing out in dozens of places at once. The huddle began to form again, the males drawing closer together for warmth, each one now carrying a single, irreplaceable egg. The females, their work for now complete, moved off in small lines, their shapes dwindling against the white horizon. The young male shifted his stance slightly, feeling the egg roll gently against the skin of his feet. Its smoothness was deceptive. Inside, the chick was a complex, growing thing, its organs forming, its heartbeat strengthening. Without his warmth, it would be gone within minutes. With his care, it would hatch into the harshest nursery in the world and survive. The wind rose suddenly, tugging at his feathers, pressing icy teeth against his sides. He bent forward, lowering his head, his body curved protectively over the brood pouch. The cold stabbed at him, but he did not move. The egg was warm. That was all that mattered. Above, the aurora flickered again, casting ghostly shadows across the snow. The green light shifted and rippled, a silent witness to the promise just made between 2 penguins in the heart of the Antarctic night, a promise of life in a land of ice. The Antarctic night was a weight in itself, pressing down on the land, on the ice, on the very bodies of the emperor penguins who dared to stand against it. Darkness here was not an absence of light, but a presence, dense and unbroken, a constant reminder that the sun had retreated far beyond the horizon and would not return for many weeks. In this darkness, the male emperor penguins formed their greatest defense, the huddle. From a distance, it looked like a single, massive organism shifting slowly, breathing in unison. Thousands of males packed tightly together, each balancing an egg on the tops of his feet, each wrapped in his brood pouch, each part of a greater whole. No one stood alone, because to do so was to surrender to the cold. The wind was a living thing here, a predator that hunted without rest. It screamed over the ice fields at speeds that could top 200 kilometers per hour, carrying with it clouds of razored snow. Even the thick, oily feathers of an emperor penguin could only slow the inevitable loss of heat. But the huddle was their answer, a living wall that trapped warmth in its core. The young male stood near the outer rim, his body exposed to the gale. He felt the sting of the wind against his back, the cold seeping through his feathers toward his skin. His muscles tensed involuntarily, a primal reflex to preserve heat. But he knew his time here was limited. Soon he would move inward, and another would take his place on the edge. This rotation was the quiet miracle of their survival, unspoken, unplanned, yet executed with precision. The mechanics of the huddle were a study in instinctive engineering. At the rim, the cold was brutal. Penguins there leaned into the wind, their backs hunched, their heads tucked down to shield their faces. They formed an unbroken ring, their bodies absorbing the worst of the gusts. Inside that ring, a second layer stood close behind, adding another barrier against the cold. The layers continued inward until, at the center, the temperature could be as much as 20 degrees Celsius warmer than the air outside. It was still below freezing, but in this world, that difference meant life. The rotation was constant but almost imperceptible. Those on the outer edge shuffled sideways, inching along the perimeter until they reached a point where they could slip inward. Others filled their place without hesitation. The movement was slow, deliberate, and silent, like the turning of gears in some vast, living machine. For the young male, the wait to move inward was both a trial and a relief. The longer he stayed on the edge, the more the cold gnawed at him. But he also knew that once he was in the warmer middle, he would have to face it again later. There was no permanent refuge. Every penguin took his turn against the wind, for if even one refused, the huddle's unity would fracture and the cold would win. He shifted his weight slightly, feeling the egg press more firmly against the warm skin of his feet. The tiny life inside was completely unaware of the danger that surrounded it. Wrapped in a shell that separated to extremes, the steady heat of the fatheress body and the killing cold of the Antarctic night, the margin for error was no more than a few degrees. Even a brief drop in temperature could slow the chick's development or end it entirely. As he waited for his turn to move inward, he studied the silhouettes around him. Each male stood nearly motionless, conserving energy. Their heads bobbed occasionally as they adjusted their positions, their breath visible in short bursts of steam. The smell of the huddle was unlike anything else, a mix of salt from the sea, the musk of oily feathers, and the faint tank of ammonia from weeks of fasting. It was not pleasant, but it was the scent of survival. Hours passed. The stars wheeled silently above, marking the slow turning of the earth. Though here, in the depths of winter, night and day were indistinguishable. The aurora returned, brighter this time, its green tendrils dancing across the heavens and casting a strange, shifting glow over the snow. In that light, the huddle looked almost like a fortress built of black stone, impenetrable and eternal. Finally, the young male felt the subtle shift of bodies around him. The penguin to his left began to edge inward, and he followed, moving carefully so as not to disturb the egg. His steps were small, sliding motions, each one measured. When his turn came to slip deeper into the mass, the change in temperature was immediate. The biting wind fell away, replaced by the muffled warmth of bodies pressed close. Here, the cold still lingered, but it no longer cut through him like a blade. He exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his muscles ease. The relief was not just physical, it was a reminder that the system worked, that the huddle could hold against the Antarctic night. But even as he warmed, he knew his time in the center was temporary. The cycle would continue, and soon enough, he would face the wind again. And so the huddle turned, hour by hour, day by day, each male giving and taking warmth in equal measure. It was a dance as old as the species itself, a silent testament to the power of cooperation in a land that offered no mercy. The young male lowered his head, his beak brushing the top of his brood pouch. Inside, the egg was warm and still. He closed his eyes and let the rhythm of the huddle, a slow movement, carry him into the next hour, into the next day, into the long, unbroken night that lay ahead. The days in the Antarctic night did not arrive with sunrise, nor did they end with sunset. Here, time was measured in the rise and fall of the wind, in the slow rotation of the huddle, in the steady heartbeat of the egg pressed against the skin of a father's feet. For the young male emperor penguin, the days had begun to blur together, each one marked by the same silence, the same cold, and a gnawing emptiness in his belly. Hunger had been there from the start, even when he first took the egg from his mate. But in those early days, it was just a faint ache and annoyance easily ignored in the rush of new responsibility. Now, weeks later, it had grown into a constant companion, a dull and relentless pain that seemed to consume more of him with each passing hour. His body was shrinking. The thick layer of fat he had carried at the start of winter was melting away, burned for warmth. He had not tasted food in over 50 days, and his reserves were dwindling. The sharpness of hunger came in waves sometimes, a twisting knot that made him shift his stance, sometimes a hollow, empty space that seemed to echo inside his chest. There were moments when the smell of another penguin's breath, faint with the memory of fish from weeks before, made his throat tighten in longing. But there was no food here. The ocean, the only source of life in this frozen desert, was over 100 kilometers away, sealed behind ridges of ice and guarded by the bitter cold. To reach it, he would have to abandon the egg, and that was unthinkable. In the Emperor's world, the father's duty was absolute. He must guard the egg until the mother returned. If she was delayed, he would wait. If the storms worsened, he would endure. If his strength failed, then the egg would die with him. Around him, the huddle moved as always, the constant slow rotation from the rim inward, from warmth back to the edge. Every movement was calculated to conserve energy. No one wasted strength calling without reason or shifting unnecessarily. The soundscape of the colony was subdued: low murmurs, the faint rustle of feathers, the occasional slap of a flipper as one male adjusted his position. Hunger was not his alone. Every male here was fasting. Each one had started the season heavier than he had ever been, bulging with stored fat. Now, all were growing leaner, their bodies narrowing, their strength preserved for the one task that mattered. He had learned to drink snow when thirst gnawed at him, tilting his head to scoop a small clump into his beak, letting it melt slowly against the roof of his mouth. It offered no calories, but it eased the dryness in his throat and gave him the sensation, however fleeting, of taking something in. Sometimes, when the wind fell still for a rare moment, he let his eyes wander to the horizon. It was an unbroken line of white and shadow, a world without landmarks. Somewhere beyond that horizon, his mate was hunting, diving deep into the black waters, chasing silver flashes of fish, scooping krill and squid into her beak. She would be building her strength, her belly filling until she could no longer ignore the pull to return. And when she came back, she would bring food for their chick if it had survived his watch. In the huddle's heart, warmth wrapped around him like a blanket, but hunger still gnawed. The center was no true comfort. It was just a brief pause before facing the wind again. In those warmer moments, the ache in his stomach became sharper, as if the body, spared from the cold for a while, could focus on its emptiness. He found his resolve in small rituals. Every few hours, he would bow his head, touching his beak gently to the top of his brood pouch. He would listen not for sound, but for the faint vibration of life within the egg. It was a reminder that he was not fasting for nothing. He was fasting for someone who had not yet taken a breath, someone who would never remember these weeks of darkness, someone who would only exist if he endured. Storms came and went. When the wind roared, he bent forward, his body a shield. When it eased, he stood straighter, conserving his muscles. The days, if they could be called that, stacked one atop another, each marked by the slow tally of his diminishing strength. And yet, he did not falter. Hunger could twist his gut, sap his energy, make the edges of his vision dim, but it could not break the will that held his feet steady on the ice. For in this land, the strongest are not those who take the most, but those who give everything without expecting return. The young male was no longer the same bird who had taken the egg from his mate weeks ago. Hunger had burned away his softness, leaving only a hard, lean frame and a heart honed to a single purpose. Somewhere far to the north, the ocean crashed against the ice, carrying the promise of food. But here, in the still heart of the Antarctic night, the young emperor stood silent, steadfast, and starving, holding the future on his feet. The Antarctic night had a way of swallowing sound, turning even the breath of thousands of penguins into a muffled whisper. But tonight, something different was building, something the young male could feel before he could see or hear it. The air seemed thicker, heavier, pressing down on the colony with an invisible weight. The stillness was unnatural. Even the wind, which had been a constant companion, stilled for a moment, as if the entire continent were holding its breath. It was the kind of silence that came before the wrath. Somewhere far inland, high above the plateau, cold air was pooling, growing denser with every passing second. Katabatic winds born from gravity itself were gathering strength. Soon, they would spill down from the heights with unstoppable force, a river of air cascading over the ice, accelerating until it became a weapon. The young male tightened the hold of his brood pouch, pulling it snug over the smooth oval of the egg. He could feel its steady warmth radiating against his skin. Around him, the huddle shifted, not in panic, but in the slow, deliberate way of a well-trained army. The outermost layer of males thickened, the formation adjusting, so that no single bird faced the wind alone. They all knew what was coming, even if no one could see it yet. And then, without warning, the storm struck. It was not a gradual arrival but a sudden assault, a wall of air slamming into the colony with the force of a physical blow. The wind screamed, dragging fine snow into the air, until sky and ground became the same swirling white. Visibility collapsed to less than a meter. The spindrift lashed at exposed feathers like 1,000 tiny knives. The air itself seemed to vibrate, a low, continuous roar that swallowed all other sound. The young male bent low, his head tucked deep into his chest, his flippers pressed tight against his body. The egg shifted slightly as he adjusted his stance, and he instinctively rolled it back into place with the careful motion of his feet. The thought of it slipping into the open air was unthinkable. Just 30 seconds on the ice could kill the life within. The outer ring of the huddle took the full force of the storm. The males there leaned into the wind, their backs hunched, their bodies acting as a living shield for those inside. The second and third rings pressed closer, sealing every gap. At the heart of the huddle, temperatures could be 20 degrees Celsius warmer than the outside era difference that meant the line between life and death. But in a storm like this, rotation was nearly impossible. The wind's fury pinned the outer layer in place, freezing them in their posts. Those at the edge would bear the brunt for far longer than usual. The young male, standing just inside the rim, felt the relentless push of the gale against his side. Every so often, a particularly violent gust would ripple through the huddle like a physical wave, compressing their bodies even tighter. Ice began to form along the tips of his feathers, tiny crystals welding themselves together, until they formed a brittle crust. The cold was invasive. It didn't just bite at the surface, but reached inward, creeping toward his core. He flexed his toes beneath the egg, breaking any thin shell of ice that tried to form there. The warmth of his skin kept the egg safe, but the cost was his own dwindling reserves of heat and energy. Minutes blurred into hours. The wind maintained its strength, howling like some unseen beast prowling the ice. Occasionally, the deep crack of shifting sea ice boomed in the distance, a reminder that even the ground beneath them was never truly still. The huddle absorbed these sounds without flinching, their discipline unbroken. Somewhere on the rim, a male faltered. The young male saw the subtle change, a tremor running down the other bird's body, his balance shifting dangerously. For a heartbeat, his brood pouch lifted, exposing the egg to the storm's deadly cold. In a single, desperate motion, the male dropped his center of gravity, sealing the pouch again. The moment passed, but the cost in energy would be felt for days. The storm did not relent. Wind speeds climbed above 150 kilometers per hour. At that velocity, the air stopped behaving like air and became something solid, a force that sculpted the huddle's shape into a perfect curve. The spindrift thickened until it felt like standing inside a blizzard of ground glass, every particle stinging on contact. The young male focused on the only thing that mattered, the egg. He narrowed his awareness until the storm faded to a distant noise, until all that existed was the warm, fragile shell beneath him. He could almost feel the faint life inside a heartbeat, so small it seemed more like a vibration than a sound. He told himself that as long as that heartbeat continued, the storm had not won. In the rare moments between gusts, tiny rotations resumed. The huddle moved like a single organism, inching those on the edge inward to rest, sending fresh bodies out to face the wind. When his turn came to step forward, the young male did so without hesitation. Duty was not a choice here. It was survival. By the time the storm began to lose its edge, the world looked different. The horizon had been reshaped, the snow sculpted into frozen waves and ridges. The huddle, rimed in frost, was smaller now. Some eggs had not survived but tighter, more compact, its members bound even closer by what they had endured together. The young male touched his bill to his brood pouch. Warmth answered him. The egg was still alive. The storm had taken from him fat reserves, strength, perhaps even days off his own life, but it had given something back, to proof that he could withstand the worst Antarctica could throw at him and still keep his promise. Above, the aurora had returned, its green light rippling across the sky, as if the storm had never been. But on the ice below, every male knew different. The night would bring more storms, the hunger would deepen, and the cold would never stop trying to claim what they guarded. Yet for now, they had endured, and that was enough. The Antarctic winter is a long, unbroken sentence, written in darkness and cold. But even here, in the coldest place on Earth, the sun has not abandoned the world entirely. It is simply biding its time. For weeks, the young male had known nothing but shadow, wind, and the slow turning of the huddle. He had lived by touch and sound, the press of neighbors, the muffled calls, the subtle vibration of life inside the egg beneath his brood pouch. His belly had grown hollow, his muscles lean, his reserves thinner with every passing day. Hunger had stopped speaking to him in sharp pains. Now it whispered constantly, a low hum under everything else. But then, one day, if you could still call it a day, something changed in the air. The black dome overhead softened. It was not sunrise, not yet, but a thin blade of blue traced itself across the horizon. It was so faint he thought at first it might be a trick of the wind, the way drifting snow sometimes painted illusions in the distance. But it stayed, it grew. The long night of Antarctica had reached its tipping point. The colony stirred not, with noise or sudden movement, but with a subtle lift in posture, a shift in rhythm. Heads rose just a fraction higher. The huddle's rotation seemed lighter, more fluid. The penguins could feel what was coming, the slow return of light, and with it, the long-awaited arrival of their mates. The young male kept his focus on the egg, but he allowed himself a glance at the horizon whenever the rotation brought his face toward it. That pale glow was a promise. Soon, the world would be more than a circle of bodies and a wall of wind. Soon, shapes would emerge from the whiteness, shapes, carrying food, shapes he would recognize by voice alone. Days or perhaps weeks later, the glow became a true light. The first rays of the sun in months brushed across the ice, igniting the surface into a scatter of diamonds. It was not warmth yet, not enough to ease the cold that gnawed at his bones. But it was a sign that the season of waiting was nearing its end. The colony's shadow stretched across the snow, and in that shadow, the young male could see his own outline, thinner now, lean and sharp, but still standing. And then, one morning, a sound pierced the air, a call, high and clear, carrying over the ice. It was not random, it was a pattern, a rhythm written into his memory. His head snapped up. The sound came again, threading through the noise of the colony until it reached him. It was her. Somewhere beyond the outer ranks, his mate had returned from the sea. She would be heavier now, her belly full of fish, squid, and krillfur, lifeline he and the chick had been waiting for. She was calling for him, just as he would call for her if their roles were reversed. The recognition was immediate, as if no time had passed at all. Emperor penguins can pick their partner's voice from among thousands, a skill more precise than any human fingerprint. He answered, his own call cutting through the air, and began to edge toward the sound, careful not to break the precious circle that had kept him and the egg live all these weeks. The reunion was close, but the ritual of survival still held. The egg must be handed over carefully, and only when the chick inside was ready to face the world. In that moment, with the light glinting off the frost in his feathers and the echo of her voice in his ears, he realized he had endured the worst the winter could throw at him. Storms had tried to break him. Hunger had tried to hollow him out. Darkness had tried to erase the days. And yet, here he was alive, steady, and still guarding the future, balanced on his feet. The sun had returned. So had she. And soon, so would life. The Antarctic air carried sound differently than anywhere else on Earth. It didn't just travel, it seemed to slice through the cold, each note sharp and crystalline. That was why, even amid thousands of penguins, the young male could pick her call out instantly. It reached him like a thread thrown across the expanse. A rising note, a pause, then a double pulse, low and resonant. It was the same pattern she had sung months ago, before she had turned toward the sea and left him to guard their future. He felt it before he processed it. His body reacted, heart rate quickening, head lifting, pupils narrowing to fix on the direction of the sound. He answered. The call that left his throat was not just a noise. It was a signal, a name, a map leading her to him through the shifting maze of the colony. Emperor penguins mate for the season, sometimes longer, and each pair's duet is unique. Even after months apart, their voices locked together perfectly, weaving a sound no other pair could mimic. From the outer edge, shapes began to appear, dark heads over white bellies, waddling steadily forward. The returning females were heavier now, their journeys from the sea written in the salt, scent clinging to their feathers. Each carried a belly full of partially digested food, the precious cargo that would be the chick's first meal. The young male felt her before he saw her. She broke through the last rank of bodies, her eyes locking onto his in an unbroken gaze. They stood for a heartbeat, silent but brimming with recognition. Then she approached, her steps sure, despite the shifting snow beneath her. When they met, there was no display of exuberance, only a precise, careful ritual. They bowed their heads toward each other, bills nearly touching, exchanging a series of quiet calls. Then came the delicate handover. He leaned forward slightly, shifting his weight. The brood pouch loosened just enough for the egg to roll onto her feet. It was a movement honed by instinct and necessity, no hesitation, no fumbling. For a few seconds, the egg was between them, balanced perfectly on the ice, cradled by nothing but trust. She slid it onto her feet and closed her pouch over it, sealing it once again in warmth. Inside, the chick was ready. The shell, which had been smooth for weeks, now bore faint cracks, hairline fractures tracing a map of the life within. From inside came the smallest sound, a dry tapping that seemed almost impossible in this silent land. It was the chick's egg tooth, a temporary, sharp nub on its beak striking the shell in patient, rhythmic blows. They both bent low, listening. The tapping came again, steady and sure. The young male felt something shift inside him and ache, but not from hunger. It was the knowledge that his long vigil was ending, that soon his role would change. He would no longer be the sole guardian. His duty now would be to recover his strength, so he could hunt for the family in the weeks to come. They remained together as the tapping grew stronger, their bodies forming a windbreak around the egg. In that moment, the storm, the darkness, the hunger, all of it, receded. What filled the space instead was the sound of life knocking at its shell, asking to be let into the world. The first sliver of beak appeared. Then, slowly, the chick pushed its head through, damp down, clinging to its skin. It gave a thin, wavering cry, one that seemed to echo impossibly far in the frozen air. Both parents leaned in, their calls soft and low, greeting the new life they had carried across the longest night. The young male closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. He had kept his promise. The Antarctic had thrown everything at him, and still, the chick had arrived. Soon, he would turn toward the horizon, toward the ocean and the hunt. But for now, he stayed. The light had returned, his mate had returned, and his chick, small, fragile, but fierce, had come into the world. The new chick's first moments were a blur of sound, breath, and the sharp scent of the frozen air. Its down was still damp from the egg's inner warmth, clinging in tiny spikes across its small, rounded body. Eyes half closed against the brightness of the snow, it wavered unsteadily, supported by the gentle curve of its mother's brood pouch. The young male watched in silence. For months, he had known the egg only as a smooth, silent weight. Now it was alive, blinking, shifting, its tiny chest rising and falling in fast, shallow breaths. Every instinct in him wanted to reach out, to shield the chick from the cold, to keep it pressed against the heat of his own body. But the cycle had turned. It was her turn now. The mother lowered her head until her bill brushed the chick's down. She called softly, a high, quick series of notes, each one a thread, drawing the chick's attention upward. The chick answered with a thin, reedy cry, its beak opening and closing in an unsteady rhythm. Then she fed it. The food she carried was not fresh fish, but a rich slurry she had stored deep in her stomach, partially digested fish, squid, and krill, kept warm inside her body during her long journey back from the ocean. She opened her beak, and the chick reached up instinctively, its tiny bill fitting inside hers. With careful, pulsing motions, she transferred the food into its throat. The chick swallowed greedily, its neck trembling with the effort. The young male could almost feel the relief radiating from the chick's small body, as warmth spread through it from the inside. Hunger had been the first sensation of its life, and now it knew what it was to be full. The sound of its cries softened, turning into a steady, quiet peeping. For the father, the sight was a strange mix of pride and ache. His vigil was over, but so too was his closeness to the chick, at least for now. His body was dangerously thin, his energy reserves almost gone. The sea was calling him. He stepped closer to his mate. They touched bills in a brief, silent exchange, a gesture that spoke of recognition, trust, and the unbroken bond of their shared effort. She would stay here with the chick, guarding it, feeding it, keeping it alive in the still harsh cold of the Antarctic spring. He would go to the ocean. The journey ahead was long over 100 kilometers of snow and ice, treacherous ridges, and shifting cracks that could open without warning. Beyond lay the sea, black and restless, dotted with icebergs. It was a dangerous place, patrolled by leopard seals and orcas, but it was also the only place he could restore his strength. He looked at the chick one last time before leaving. It had curled into the shelter of its mother's pouch, a small ball of life against the vast, frozen emptiness. He memorized the sight, carrying it with him like a talisman. When he turned and began to walk, his steps were slow but steady. Behind him, the colony shimmered in the pale light, a living fortress against the cold. Ahead, the horizon stretched into white infinity, the distant scent of salt faint on the air. The sea awaited him, and he would return with food, with strength, with the means to carry their shared story forward. For now, the gift of life was safe in her care. The decision to leave was never sudden. It built in quiet layers, first as a whisper of salt in the wind, then as a tightening in his empty belly, and finally as an undeniable pull that drew his gaze again and again toward the horizon. The young male emperor penguin had fulfilled his vigil. The egg had hatched, the chick had been fed. Now his own survival demanded that he turn away from the colony and seek the ocean. He moved slowly at first, careful not to disturb the tight formations of other males still guarding their chicks. Each step was a shuffle, claws scraping faintly on the hard-packed snow. Behind him, his mate stood over their chick, her posture tall and steady, head tilted slightly in his direction. They exchanged no calls, there was no need. She knew why he was leaving. He knew she would guard their young with the same unyielding devotion he had given through the long night. The air was sharp with cold, but different, now less oppressive than in the depth of winter. The sun had climbed just high enough to cast long shadows across the ice, revealing ridges and wind-carved patterns in the snow. He joined a small line of other males, each gaunt and hollow-eyed, their bodies lean from months of fasting. They moved together, their tracks etching a dark line across the pristine white. The journey was not simply a straight march. The ice was alive beneath their feet, shifting, cracking, groaning as the pressure of the continent's weight pushed against the frozen sea. Wide fissures appeared without warning, forcing the group to detour. Some crevasses were shallow, their edges solid enough to cross in a short leap. Others yawned wide and deep, their depths swallowing the light. These required long, winding routes to avoid. Hunger was a constant, gnawing presence, but so too was caution. Predators could haunt even the ice. Giant petrels patrolled the skies, their shadows gliding over the snow. On the ice's edge, leopard seals sometimes hauled themselves out to rest, their long bodies blending into the mottled surface until they moved with startling speed. After 2 days of steady travel, the horizon began to change. What had been an endless sweep of white now shimmered with a darker band, the ocean. The sight triggered a surge of energy in the group. Their pace quickened, their steps more certain, the scent of salt growing stronger with each kilometer. The sound reached them before the water did a deep, constant murmur, the breathing of the sea under the ice. The wind carried the tang of brine, rich and heavy, awakening instincts buried under months of cold and hunger. When the ice finally broke into a jagged shoreline, the black water beyond seemed to pulse with life. Waves rolled against the floes, the surface dotted with chunks of drifting ice. Beneath that surface lay everything they had been craving. Fish flashing like silver darts, ribbons of squid, clouds of krill so dense they turned the water red. Without hesitation, the first penguins slid forward on their bellies, launching into the water in smooth arcs. The young male followed, the shock of the ocean wrapping around him like a cold embrace. But unlike the killing cold of the wind, this was a familiar chill, one his body was built for. He dove deep. Light fractured above him, scattering into shifting patterns as he swam. His wings, so clumsy on land, became perfect tools here, propelling him with swift, powerful strokes. He moved through the water like an arrow, his hunger sharpening his focus. The hunt was quick. He darted after fish, snapping them up in sharp, practiced strikes. Schools scattered at his approach, but he pursued relentlessly, swallowing each catch-hole. Squid writhed in his beak before vanishing down his throat. Krill swept past in shimmering clouds, their soft bodies bursting with oil-rich nutrition. With every mouthful, his strength began to return. Muscles that had been running on reserves for months filled with new energy. The hollowness in his belly eased, replaced by a steady, satisfying weight. But even in the comfort of feeding, his thoughts did not stray far from the colony. He was not here just for himself. Each fish, each squid, each mouthful of krill was not only fuel for his body, but also for the long return journey and the future meals he would bring to his chick. He would store what he could in his stomach, not for digestion, but for safe transport and offering of life carried across the ice. As he surfaced for air, droplets ran down the sleek black feathers of his head, catching the sunlight in tiny sparks. Behind him, the ocean stretched to the horizon, endless and alive. Ahead, far beyond the ice floes, waited the colony, the mate, and the chick that carried his legacy. He had made it to the sea, he had eaten, he would return, and when he did, the cycle of the emperor penguin of endurance, sacrifice, and the unbroken chain of life would continue. The sea had given him back his strength, but the ocean's embrace could not hold him forever. The colony and his family waited far inland. His belly was full now, but not for himself. Much of what he carried was stored in a special part of his stomach, undigested, preserved in a warm slurry of fish, squid, and krill. It was the chick's first true gift from him, a meal that would fuel its rapid growth in the harshest nursery on earth. Every beat of his heart urged him back toward the ice. The journey inland was no easier for being well fed. The ocean's black waters and shifting flows gave way once again to the endless white plain. His body, heavier now with the weight of food, labored against the wind. The tracks left on his way out had long since vanished under drifting snow, but instinct pointed him homeward with unerring precision. He traveled in a loose line with other males making the same return. Sometimes they moved in silence. Sometimes they gave low calls, not to find each other, but to remind themselves that they were not alone on the ice. The Antarctic could strip a bird to its bones in days if it took a wrong turn, but together, they were less vulnerable. Days passed. The sun, still low on the horizon, painted the snow with bands of pale gold and blue. Shadows stretched long, and every ridge in the ice caught the light like a frozen wave. As they neared the colony, the air began to change, not warmer, but filled with a different sound. The layered chorus of thousands of penguin calls, each one a unique voice in a living symphony. And then, he saw them, dark shapes clustered tightly against the wind. The heart of the colony beating steadily in the middle of the Antarctic expanse. The moment he stepped within sight, his voice rose in a call. It was loud, carrying across the snow in a pattern only his mate would know. From deep inside the huddle, a reply came, a sound that pierced through all others and went straight to him. He followed it, weaving through the dense ranks until her familiar form appeared, the chick sheltered beneath her brood pouch. The reunion was brief but full of meaning. They touched bills, their calls interlacing in a duet that reaffirmed their bond. She stepped back, revealing the chick a little larger now, its down fluffier, its eyes brighter. He leaned forward and began to feed. The chick's beak pressed eagerly into his, and he regurgitated the stored meal, rich and warm, directly into its throat. The chick swallowed greedily, its small body trembling with the effort. This was the reason for his journey, the culmination of months of sacrifice and the reward for enduring the long night. Once the chick was full, it nestled between them, blinking sleepily in the cold light. The two parents stood close, their bodies forming a living wall against the wind. Now it was her turn to leave. The mother, lighter after weeks of fasting, needed the ocean as he had. She would make the same journey he had just completed, bringing back another offering of life for their chick. The roles had shifted, but the rhythm was the same. As she departed, he watched her until she became a shadow against the horizon, just as she had done for him months earlier. Then he turned his attention back to the chick. It peeped softly, burrowing deeper into the shelter of his body. He would protect it until she returned, just as he had before, rotating in the huddle, guarding against the wind, enduring hunger once more. The cycle would continue until the chick was strong enough to stand on its own, to waddle toward the sea and dive into the life that awaited it there. One day, perhaps, this chick would take its place in the huddle, guarding its own egg through the long Antarctic night. For now, the young male stood, steady and patient, the frozen plain stretching in all directions. The storms would come again, the hunger would return, but so would the light, so would the sea, and so would the will to endure. In the heart of the coldest place on earth, the cycle held unbroken, ancient and alive.